recording. There we go. And with that, let's have the first speaker of the proposition.
Can I be heard?
Yeah, you can be heard.
Okay, just give me a moment. Thank you. On proposition, Team Canada believes that there is a significant problem in the status quo, where we have our future generations and we have significant amounts of children being born, but no one, unfortunately, to take care of those children. Where children turn to gangs because they feel like they don't have other support structures within their familial unit. Where they have less role models and a lack of those role models and guiding figures to support them when they're feeling a little bit lost in life. On our side, we stand to provide the beating heart back to these communities to allow children to have those parental figures and those important roles, which we think are crucial in child development. And that's why we're very proud of stand up proposition. I'll do two things in the speech. First of all, I'll go over the setup, and then I'll give two constructive arguments. The first is on why we get better care for children, and the second is going to be on why we benefit communities on our side of the house. To the model, three parts. Number one, how big are these families and these sort of communal units going to be? Most of these bonds we think are likely to be formed out of convenience. For example, neighborhoods, because they might be physically closest to you as a family. But it's worth noting that this might change depending on where you live. So for instance, if you're in a rural area, that might be the entire town. If it's just an apartment block, it might just be your neighbors within that block. But no matter where you live, we still think our benefits apply in this instance. The second thing to point out is what this care even looks like in the first place. We think it looks like going over to your neighbor's house when your parents might be busy with work or something like that. It looks like being able to walk over to your friend's house if you need some support from that from that parent. We think it's going to be envision this similar to a relationship to a teacher with who you're incredibly close with, for example, someone like a step parent or even just family friends that exist in the status quo. Now, I want to be very clear here. Obviously, you will still have a strong relationship with your parent, given the fact that you're living with that parent, given the fact that you might have meals with that parent, but you would also get the community benefits on our side of the house. The final thing that I want to frame here is why communal parenting is likely to lead to good care for these children, why these communities are going to make a decent effort to care and love that child. Three reasons here. The first thing to point out is that this is likely to be a social norm, i.e., you are socially expected to take care of other people's children when you can, for example. We think this is likely to develop as such, given the wording of the motion. The second thing to point out is that there are mutual benefits here, i.e., if I take care of my neighbor's kids, my neighbor is more likely to also take care of my kid because of the fact that you create that narrative of mutual dependence. And we think that that sense is also likely to form. The final thing that I want to point out here is that these may often be family friends who your family is very close to, or for example, kids that are friends with your neighbor's kid or kids that are friends with your kid, for example. So I think given that there are some degree of communal structures that already exist in the status quo, some degree of closeness, I think that is just something that people will be willing to do out of the goodness of their own heart on our side. Let's get to the first claim on why you get better care for children. And there are four things I want to say here. The first is that you get more diverse viewpoints exposed to the child. We think this looks like, for example, moderately religious families, which often indoctrinate their child to believe in that religion, or conservative families, for example, which can often espouse those views on their children and make their child think those types of views. On our side, they are exposed to different parents with divergent viewpoints. For instance, watching the news with a community figure and learning about what their different viewpoints are, or your family figure that you're going to because of the fact that they're in your community, practicing different types of religious practices, I think that means that you're more exposed to those different type of viewpoints. The implication of this is that your views are likely to be far more diverse. Given that you're exposed to those different viewpoints, you're more likely to find those views yourself rather than what your parents tell you, which I think is more likely to line up with what you want and what your subjective best interest is if you are exposed to things like religion, for example. The second thing to point out here, no thanks, is on different parenting viewpoints specifically. Note that there are different ways to parent. For instance, something like unconditional versus conditional love, or something like tiger parenting as a style of parenting. And it's worth noting that these parenting styles are likely to be diverse because the fact that different factors often affect these parenting. So for instance, what your own parents did, for example, might shape the way that you take care of your child. On our side, that child is exposed to different ways of parenting that might work differently depending on which child you are. And on our side, community figures can, for example, tell the biological parents what helps and what doesn't, or children themselves can explain what works and what doesn't. And it's important to note that parents will often want to help that child. They often are willing to adapt given the bond that they have with their children, as opposite might want to explain. but that only happens when the child is exposed to those different viewpoints and when they know about them in the first place and they know what is truly best for them. The comparative is one in which you have one viewpoint oftentimes, given the fact that you only have one biological parent or two in many cases. And therefore, we think that if, for example, a certain viewpoint is incompatible with that child, that can lead to an immense amount of hopelessness where you don't feel cared for as a child. For instance, the stress placed on children that often happens when they're not ready for something like tiger parenting, which we think is uniquely something we can solve on side proposition. The third thing I want to point out here is that parents are often not very present in their child's life for a few different reasons. The first thing to point out is that parents are just often busy in terms of things like going to work, going on business trips, going on dates with their significant other. That means there is often a lack of care for the child, obviously, given the fact that these parents are busy. And it's important to note that the community on our side just has more people to cover for those biological parents when they are away. I think it's incredibly important, and this argument is incredibly important, and it's important to have children having those authority figures and those role models within their lives so they can have a sense of belonging as a child, some place where you actually belong and a place where your family takes care of you, someone who can guide you and give you support when you're feeling lost in life. And we think that's incredibly important and something that doesn't happen when those children, when those parents, unfortunately, aren't present in their children's life. The second thing to point out here is dysfunctional families. For instance, families that often fight with each other or might be going through something like a divorce. It's important that that child doesn't feel trapped. They don't feel isolated within that, but that they can go to a separate place, a separate home, and still feel part of a family and still feel a sense of belonging, when otherwise that would often lead to immense amount of stress and mental anguish on that child, seeing their parents fight, for example, and feeling like they don't belong within that family. The third thing to point out is that oftentimes children are scared of telling their parents about certain types of things. For instance, if a child is drinking and being drunk, they're scared to go home because they know their parents might be adamant about that and might repudiate them. Then I think that might put them in unsafe situations, for example, where they might be lonely. They might be physically unsafe in terms of the types of things that happen oftentimes to, for example, young women. On our side, those individuals can go get help from their communities. They have a place to stay when they've made mistakes, unlike being rejected by their own parents. The final thing to point out here is that there is financial conditions that often restrict the ability for parents to do good things. For instance, not being able to provide for the child in some cases in terms of something like a meal for that child. On our side, that child can go to a neighbor, have dinner with that neighbor, for example, whereas otherwise that would place immense financial stress on that parent. That might be money that is taken out of something like rent, for example, and we think that's an incredible harm on opposition side. Let's get into the second broad claim on benefiting communities. And the problem here is that in the status quo, people often feel disillusioned with your family, that maybe you are somewhat friendly with your neighbor, but you're never actually making a close emotional bond and a tight-knit connection with that neighbor in the first place. On our side of the house, given the fact that you can, for example, go to their house, make friends with them, make incredibly important bonds, we think in many cases with those role models, you're far more likely to get that communal support and that feeling of obligation that you have to others within your community. The implication of this is a couple things. The first thing to say that you probably get less crime. For example, a child is less likely to rob their communal care networks because of the fact that they feel an obligation. They feel a sense of belonging within that community, and they're more likely to do those types of things. The second thing to say here is that there is a cycle in terms of you feeling an obligation to community, which means that when you grow up as a child, you are likely to participate in communal parenting as well and subsequently benefit that community with all the benefits we talked about in the first argument. For all those reasons, we're very proud of stand on proposition.
Thank you for that speech. With that, let's call the first speaker of the opposition whenever you're ready.
Just making sure I'm audible. Okay, awesome. Here's why side propositions advocacy undercuts every single point they brought up. They never make a distinction between their world and the status quo. In the status quo, people still have an incentive to go to their neighbors, to talk to their neighbors, and become friends with those around them. We don't think that side proposition ever proves to you why uniquely communal raising is going to provide unique benefits to children and to families. That's why they've already lost today's debate. Proud to oppose today's motion. This House prefers a world where children are raised communally. In today's speech, a couple of things. First, a few notes on framework before responding to side proposition substantive material, and then introducing our two substantive arguments. Let's first talk about what our world looks like. First, let's talk about Proposition's world, though. On their side, they have to defend many parents having an active or equal role within the parenting of one child. If primary caregivers have the primary influence over the child, it undercuts much of the material in Proposition, since it largely resembles the status quo, right? Because what they tell you is that, okay, on their side of the house is just going to your friend's house when your parents are busy, just seeking out family friends in your neighborhood. If that's true, then they really don't have any distinction from the status quo, because that already happens without that communal raising, right? What they have to be advocating for is many parents acting as authoritarian figures that are going to impose some sort of view on those children, that are going to act as some authority figure on those children as well. On our side of the house, children have access to things like school teachers, counselors, coaches, family friends, and other trusted adults in their life as well. Even further, we largely reject the notion that society isn't coercive. There's a massive amount of societal pressure that is harmful, and your parent can't act as your navigator, leaving you with no protection against these norms. Even further, on our side of the house, we would actively support the funding of child support, protection services, and daycare so that we can effectively combat abuse. 3 notes here. First, the majority of parents simply aren't abusive. Second of all, the majority of parents who are abusive are removed from that relationship already. And third, we'd also actively encourage increased protections to ensure that abusive relationships aren't able to occur in the future. These services allow individual parents to do their job better, but do not extend their role to society. That's why they're available in opposition world. But let's quickly chat about what side Proposition gave you in their first and second substantive. In their first substantive, they just tell you that children and families are able to diversify their narrative when they're forced to go out and seek other individuals who have different views as they do. 2 things here. First, I think that this is quite a big mischaracterization of what truly happens in a Proposition world. As a parent, as an authoritarian figure, you actively want to impose your views on a child because you believe you know what is best for that child. So it's not simply you go to someone's house and you get to be diversified because they have a different view as you. It's that parent actively trying to convert you or actively trying to impose some form of view on you when you go to their house. We don't think that Proposition really engages with what their world truly looks like. But even further, if I'm a devout Christian who doesn't want my child to, change their views on that religion, why do I send them to my neighbor's house who has fundamentally different religious views than I do? You don't do that, because if at most Proposition's world is only a societal norm that urges individuals to send their children to other houses, there's literally no way that you force individuals to actually diversify their narratives. Those who diversify are going to seek diversification on either side of the house. They don't gain any benefit from this substantive one. But even further, on the substantive 2 about emotional support, we would say that we support things like social services, accessible daycare on our side of the house. We don't think that necessarily parents being not present in life is a reason why you vote for Proposition, because we also encourage those parents to be present in their life in different venues. But even further, we also think that this idea of emotional support, others being there for that child, isn't something unique to Proposition, right? Because on our world, in the status quo, people already go to their neighbors to seek help. If these benefits are so good, people are already going to go to these individuals around them in their community and seek that out anyways. I'll take your point.
You correctly point out you still have access to support networks for children's development. What do you think is the tangible difference between parenting and those support networks?
Sure. The reason why we think parenting is so uniquely harmful when you allow for communities to come together is that active imposing of your values on others, right? We think that when you have support networks where you don't force individuals to take on a parental figure, you actually allow for that support to not only be active imposing on your views, but also just having support in general. Let's go on to our first substantive, talking about better development for children. Understand that it's extremely tough for a 5-year-old to discern between 5 views of morality that is imposed on them from multiple figures that they look up to as an individual to direct them through the world. It's extremely hard for a child to set up a moral compass or establish a way to view the world when there's constantly an entire community with differing values between every household telling that child that their way of thinking is absolute. We'd prefer a world in which a single household can propose a way of thinking rather than forcing so many differing ones on a literal child. Children are largely unable to form their own moral identity when they're so confused by the distinctive views being pushed onto them by the large community, when they're forced to adopt multiple views rather than just one single one to form their own. But even further, we think that there's also a lack of an emotional connection in Proposition's world, right? Communities writ large are are impossible to put a face on, especially early on in a child's life. Children need a large amount of emotional support. We think that the broad society is a largely intimidating place, and a parent's role is to protect them from everything around them. When that's codified legally, it is most important that the child feels this protection. But even further, last point here, we think it's hard to get to know children, right? It takes a lifetime to truly understand your child and know your child really well. Proposition's world is not that suddenly each child within the community gets far more dedicated attention. The attention they get is divided and sporadic. No parental figure will ever truly understand them in the way that a parent understands their child on our side of the house. We think that this is the most vulnerable time of a child's life when you don't have established emotional connections with the parental figure. You don't have that valuable support that lets you grow and develop. Our substantive 2 is talking about the isolation of communities. 2 bits of characterization at the top. First, communities are segregated right now. In the status quo, cities and towns are often segregated, that is by wealth and by race. So you have quite clear divides between wealthy white communities and poorer minority ones. Also recognize that their side of communal parents is within these small communities. That is to say that we agree it won't be the entire city of New York raising the children, it's more so the individual communities. We also think that in their world, children are less likely to move out of their community for a few incentives. First, because children view an obligation to their community and thus are more likely to stay in their neighborhoods, right? People feel tied down because you have some obligation to those who give you some support. But additionally, communal parenting, your entire social network is within the small community, so neighborhoods are further segregated in terms of wealth and race. 3 broad impacts of this. First, socioeconomic status. Rich communities continue to concentrate wealth when poor communities experience more concentrated forms of poverty over generations. You don't get that geographical and systemic dispersion of wealth. Even further, that worldview of people is now becoming more isolated. These communities that self-segregate based on ideology so that their child is raised the way they want to is literally never get exposed to diversity as it is sustainable as it is sustainable for them to not live within a community that doesn't. There's no need for you to experience a broader view than the view you were raised with, as your community all has the same view. But even further, last impact here is that there's a social divide that's ideological. Broad communities are no longer integrated as a whole. Rather, you have homogeneous communities that are segregated. There's less of a mix of ideas that lead to a progressive society we're proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech. And with that, we can have the second speaker of the proposition.
Everyone hear me? Opposition in this debate couldn't decide if communities were homogenous and thus none of our benefits were going to be accessed, or if they were going to be so diverse that children were going to be wildly confused and never actually able to shape their own identities because there were a million different forces all pulling them in different directions and telling them to believe in different things. Because of that reason, I don't think they can win this debate today, and they're going to have to do a lot of work in seconds picking attention, picking a side, and explaining why it's true. Thus, I want to talk to you about 2 things in my speech. First, I want to talk to you about the identities of children and how this impacts families. Second, I want to talk to you about communities, then an argument about how we think this makes it more accessible for working people to have children. First, on this idea of how this shapes children and families, what did we get from opposition? They told us that the case we gave you was mostly the status quo, and it was just you can spend time with family, friends, and stuff. One, I don't know if they heard Alex's speech, but we literally characterized to you that this would be like having a bunch of different step parents or something like that. So I think that our case was actually largely contingent on the fact that you have lots of parents enforcing different viewpoints on you. That was how we accessed the benefits that we brought to you. No, thank you. For example, on things like having different political beliefs or different religious beliefs or different values exposed to you. So I think that our characterization was just not the one that they wanted to tell you it was. Second, they told you that parents are going to actively push their viewpoints on you. And because parents are very static in the views that they believe, and they want and biological parents want their children to be the same as them, they're only going to have communities be insular and have co-parents that have similar beliefs as biological parents. I just want to say that this is a quite marginal, but also I think the characterization they bring to you is a little ridiculous, because there are people who have conservative political views, but don't think that liberals are terrible people, or don't think that they can't be trusted with their children. I think that in communities, there is a reasonable amount of diversity in terms of things like religious beliefs, in terms of things like political beliefs, in terms of things like values. So for example, one parent might value honesty and one parent might value kindness. So we do just have some level of diversity. If they want to talk to you about really, really extreme religious communities, for example, a community of evangelical Christians, that's just going to be the same on both sides of the house, because religious people are either not going to be that aggressively religious and are going to live in homogenous communities, or they're going to live in massively exclusionary communities, and you're never going to have like a Hindu or a Muslim or a Jewish person moving into those. So I just think that this argument was quite uncomparative. If you're going to have static communities, you're going to have that on both sides of the house. But also note that this piece of refutation was massively tense with the characterization of their first argument, because either these circles of parents were going to be so static and so similar to your biological parent that you weren't going to be able to access any of our benefits, or children were going to be massively confused and not able to shape their own identity or values. I just want to talk now about this first argument they bring you about why it's hard for people to, or why it's hard for children, no thank you, to shape their moral compasses when they have differing viewpoints. One, I think that what we actually get on our side is well-roundedness rather than confusion, because a lot of times people have different values, but those values aren't necessarily tense with each other. So for example, at a very young age, you're probably not going to be telling your kid why taxes need to be lower or why you should vote Republican in the next election. At young ages, you're going to be telling your kids, for example, that they need to value things like kindness or honesty or intelligence or integrity, things like that. So I think that you can probably have a variety of parents that prioritize different values like those, all telling children to have those values themselves, and you get more well-rounded children. You get children who are more introspective, who think about how their actions impact others more, who have a more evenly weighted set of beliefs. If they want to talk about things like political beliefs and things like those, at the point at which maybe a children gets a little older and those become discussions at the dinner table, at the point at which children are exposed to different good arguments for both sides, they're actually more likely to come to conclusions on their own, because I don't think parents even discuss these things with children until the point at which they're ready to actually understand them. And if they do, when they have different viewpoints, they get a better understanding. So I think that this argument about confusion just had a failure to understand the timeline of at what point what things get discussed with children and how those things interact with each other, why they're often not in tension or not confusing for children. Second, I want to talk to you about what they tell you about how it's difficult to bond with your children. One, I think that this claim is just largely grounded in a strange place, because note that love is not a finite resource. There's no amount of scarcity. So whether you have one children or 12, you probably still love them the same amount. That still happens whether you have one parent or 12. Second, if they want to hang their case on the volume of exposure, the comparative isn't necessarily better, because lots of parents are absent for various reasons. They have to work long hours. They can't always come home at night. All the reasons that Alex tells you. Third, I think that it's good to know that a lot of people love you. So for example, when you have a bunch of different parental figures in your life who all deeply care about you, you feel safe. That's good for your self-esteem, things like that. So there's actually benefits to having more parents, not less. But finally, I think that this argument is just empirically untrue. So I might see my debate friends less than I see my school friends, but we're probably just as close. But also, I want to point out an extension to our first argument. We actually get better bonding between parents and children on our side, because parents have more flexibility and freedom and are less likely to become frustrated with their child, because if, say, they want to go out with their significant other and prioritize their marriage instead of their child for once to try to preserve that, they can send their kid to be taken care of by the community, things like that. Second theme then on inequality and communities and things like that. The argument we got from opposition is that communal parenting enshrines inequality because often communities are divided on social or political or economic lines. This argument was wildly uncomparative, because note that on their side, they had one parent telling children their beliefs. So if you grow up in a wealthy white family that's quite conservative, you're just guaranteed to be wealthy, white, and conservative probably, because you have no exposure to anyone else on their side of the house. At least on our side, where you maybe have a community of 10 or 20 or 30 different parents, it's very likely you're going to have some religious diversity, you're going to have some racial diversity, you're going to have some economic diversity. So even if one person in your community is quite wealthy, or one of your parents is quite wealthy, you're also going to have people from the middle class. Even if some people in your community are Catholic, you're probably going to have some people that are Jewish. Even if some people are conservative, you're going to have some people that are liberal. So you get more exposure on our side than on theirs, where it's just one parent. I think that inequality is probably a lot worse on their side in terms of like homogeneity of views. Then my argument, finally, on accessibility for working people to have children. Note that the problem in the status quo is that there's a lot of barriers that stand in front of people who have to work full time when they want to have children. These things look like working long hours or inconvenient shifts. For example, nurses who have to work at night, assembly line workers that have to start their work at 4 a.m. and can't drive their children to school. No, thank you. This looks like the woman who works in law enforcement or as a corrections officer or who handles heavy machinery and knows that she can't afford to take time off while she's pregnant and go on maternity leave after she's had her child. This just looks like people who can't afford maternity leave in general. How does this change on our side of the house? Because you don't need to worry about things like being unable to afford childcare because you have a community that you can rely on. Because if you know, okay, I work at night, you can volunteer to take care of the community's children after school and have your kids sleep with someone else at night to make sure that you actually can afford to go and do your job at the end of the day. And it's now more feasible for you to have children, that they have an emotional connection and bond in their life. But also, you don't need to worry about your kids having absentee parents, because note that in a lot of cases, parents who have to work at weird hours or who aren't necessarily able to see their children all the time feel quite guilty because they feel like there's no one there providing the emotional support that their kid requires. At the point at which we access something like communal parenting, wherein your children has many different emotional sources to fall back on, where they have many different people in the community who they trust, who are there to support them, parents are less likely to feel guilty when they have to do the simple act of going to work to put food on the table. This puts less strain on the emotional dynamics in families. Marriages don't fail. Children and parents fall out less. For that reason, I think we win this debate on proposition. So proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. With that, let's have the second speaker of the opposition.
Can everybody hear me? I think the biggest strategic problem that loses side proposition the debate is that they try to claim the benefits of having so many parents that deeply care about you, while they characterize their co-parenting or community parenting as going over for a night or having dinner with the neighbors once in a while, right? I think it is wildly conflicting that they would want to claim all the benefits of a parenthood where you're deeply devoted to one child and prioritizing them, while giving examples and characterizing their own world as a place in which perhaps the neighbors help out. In my speech, I want to do a couple of things. Firstly, I want to go over the strategic problems on their side of the house and broadly why we're up in this debate. Go on to the two clashes of today's debate. Firstly, on the development of the child. Secondly, on inequality and the broader societal impacts. And then lastly, provide my third substantive argument, which is a principle on social consent. So firstly, let's talk about the characterization, the narrative that they're pushing on their side of the house. If we look to the inflow slide as well as the motion clearly states that these individuals can act as authority figures. So it's weird that they're telling us that, oh, there'll be like step parents, but the extent of time you spend with them is going over for dinner and perhaps like them filling in when your parents can't actually be there, right? So I think in this situation, if they're going to resort to the primary caregivers, which are the biological parents, still having the majority of the influence and the majority of the control, much of their own benefits are undercut insofar as they're not spending enough time with these people who are supposed to give them different views. Because I'd argue that sure, you might be exposed to different views, but that happens in the status quo as well, right? Look, you go to school, you interact with different people from different backgrounds, you interact with different teachers. We think we get exposure on our side as well. If on their side, they're claiming that this exposure is going to substantially change them and have them reconsider their views, you probably have to spend far more time with them, which is not what they characterize on their side of the house. But secondly, note that on our side of the house, we do not have tension. Let me explain the two different diversities that we're talking about in today's debate. So I would say that from their characterization about distance, these communities are likely going to be formed with similar socioeconomic statuses as different communities live in different places of the cities, as we've seen in big megacities where slums and high rich end like Upper East Side Manhattan are very, very isolated and separated. We think that these lines are still going to exist, which means that largely on economic and political policy, these communities are still going to remain homogenous. What we talked about in our first substantive argument was nuance that they didn't engage with the different parenting styles that differ within these communities independent of the economic and socioeconomic situations that they're experiencing. This looks like Asian parents having the tiger mom mindset, like they brought up, but also white parents perhaps being more lenient on academics and like having their child pursue a happy life in like arts and whatnot, while another parents would push going into school for engineering, medical very, very hard and say that this is the end all be all, etc. These are the different parenting styles that we're talking about in our house that have nothing to do with all the homogenous traits of these communities based on socioeconomic status, grouped with distance in their communities, etc. So that is not tension. Don't let them think that we're making a weird argument where we're saying they're going to be confused but also the same. That's not what we're saying at all. Before I go on into my clashes, I'll take a point.
On our side, let's say that you have a tiger parent, but that parenting style doesn't necessarily work very well for you and you want more freedom. What we're able to do is actually access, for example, a parent that is more lenient or allows you to explore your passions better, which I think is actually better for children.
Okay, look. Your side still supports the primary caregiver being the person that spends the majority of time with their children, right? So presumably if they're adamant in their own parenting style that tiger mom stuff works, I doubt they're going to change just because their neighbor perhaps suggested that it would be good to send them to art classes, etc. And because they're not spending nearly as much time with the other parent, I don't think that the parent is going to be changing. I don't think that they're going to be changing their views just based on whatever the other person says, given they're already so strong-held in their views, which is why they probably impose them in the very first place. I just find this argument of parenting styles changing because of exposure to be really ridiculous, considering they characterize, once again, this communal parenting as having dinner and spending the night when your parents can't be there, which vastly undercuts all of their impacts. So firstly, let's talk about the development of the child as a clash. Let's talk about this idea of diversity. I think both sides agree that nobody is going to solve like indoctrination. If your parents adamantly want you to be Christian, they'll probably not send you to a place that will like convince you otherwise. But secondly, sure, you get that exposure that's symmetrical on our side of the house. I'm unsure of what the marginal change is on their side when you spend time with your neighbors, when you can spend time with your classmates, you can spend time with different people from interest groups on our side at school as well, right? Note that their characterization is largely leading to the downfall of this argument, since this exposure just doesn't really lead to anything substantial if it's not massive exposure on their side. But secondly, we already explained to you why in our side of the house, the parenting styles being diametrically opposed in our access into the first substantive argument. Our first substantive argument states that when children are exposed to different parenting styles and diametrically different views on life, Serena talks about kindness, right? I think a lot of parents don't support things like kindness and might characterize the world to be very cruel and throat in a place that you wouldn't value it because you might get pushed down and other people aren't kind, so you got to fight your way through, etc. These are wildly different societal characterizations that different parents can impose onto their child, and it's not a simple matter of picking like what stance you have on which political issue, but rather it's talking about when you're 5 years old in your like most crucial developmental stages, having different views of the world and being very confused on who you ought to believe because of this issue. And note that with their characterization, the parents who have these views will still prevail, considering they're still the primary caregiver, as I said, no thank you. So I think on our side of the house, no matter what, children are in a vulnerable position, and even if they're able to be exposed to all of these things, they aren't able to make a rational choice until they're 18 years old, because societal like coercion will exist either way. We think on our side of the house, in the long term, children are far more likely to make a rational choice in which they actually have the tools to decide it. But next, I want to talk about how to give care to the child, because we both agree that's very important. So they bring up this assertion, which is really just that love isn't finite. But I just think this is untrue, right? Often love is like expressed through quality time, and time is finite. You can't establish the same depth of relationship when you spend an hour a week with this neighbor and like 8 hours with your mom. So I just really don't think that the impact of everybody loving you and so much love exists insofar as the impact of these other parents are going to be marginal compared to your own biological parent. So I think on our side of the house, the harm is that parents will scapegoat these other co-parents in their community to take care of their child when they can't, which directly engage with their third substantive argument, by the way, right? They're talking about workers trying to do their job and it'll be alleviating stress. Firstly, note that in our house, we support friendly neighbors. We support a narrative in which neighbors help their other people out. So that's symmetrical in our side of the house. But secondly, I think the harm of this is that parents now believe that they don't have an active role in their child's life insofar as they can push it off to other people. And the harm of this is that now, in order order to make up for the job of that one parent, you perhaps need to spend time and split it among 4 parents, which means like a less deep relationship with each of those parents individually, which means that you ultimately don't form very meaningful bonds with any of them. And now I want to talk about inequality very quickly. I think the inequality argument is largely undercut by their characterization already. Sure, in the Upper East Side, these white kids will be able to interact with rich individuals of different backgrounds, but note that for the most poor of communities, they're far more likely going to stay in their communities in the future when you make this a norm, because they don't feel as though they have access to the other communities because they have so many obligations to give back. So in this situation, they're far more likely to not seek higher employment and to not seek like going away from their communities for better opportunities for the sake of staying in this community, because they feel social coercion to stay and give back and to parent all of these children as a community, which is ultimately harmful for all of these individuals as well as community as a whole as they continue to stay segregated. We're proud to stand on side opposition.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech. Whenever third proposition is ready.
Cool. My Wi-Fi is truly atrocious. If it's okay, can I turn off my video just to guarantee you guys can hear me? Not look
Yeah,
at me.
sure.
Cool, thank you. Cool, so you guys can hear me, right? Okay, I'll just take out the timer. When my parents first came to Canada, life was pretty hard. We weren't very rich, and they had trouble raising me while also going to work and seeking work. So they left me with their family friends who basically sponsored their immigration to Canada. The relationship I had with these people was not one of support. It was one closer to love and parenting. They raised me. I slept at their house. I was educated by them. I was fed by them. They cared for me and they paid for my expenses. That is probably closer to what we are defending on the proposition. It is one of a relationship of not imposing values. It's one of love, emotional support, and unconditional support of that child. First opposition says the difference between parenting and support is imposing values. That's a bit bizarre. Schools impose values all the time. That doesn't mean schools parent you. Parenting is one that comes from a deep emotional bond with the child, and we would much prefer children are able to form that bond with a larger community rather than not accessing it in the first place. They can no longer strawman our case. This is a relationship closer to an adopted parent or a step parent, because in order to impose your views, even if that was the distinction, you have to be close to that person. This is a very close emotional relationship. That's why they lose the debate. I'm going to talk about 2 things in this speech. No, thank you. The first will be on the effect on the relationship, and I'll bring back all of our content that was so woefully unengaged with, it hurts me. Then I'll talk about the effect on kids' views and their communities. Let's look firstly at relationships. First thing I want to bring back here is our analysis about why they can now access a parent in the first place. Because at the moment, there is very little flexibility. The modern workplace demands huge numbers of hours. You need to spend time because of your career. Their assertion is, wow, childcare, maternity leave. That obviously requires different levels of fiat. Many jobs won't offer maternity leave, and even if they did, how are you going to fiat billions of dollars going to childcare when your status quo is one where that's not available to many people? Weigh that against the guarantee of community support, the guarantee of a norm that says that people are going to take care of your children when you're busy. No, thank you. No, thanks. This is really important because being able to form a loving relationship is absolutely critical to a child's development. And even if you do hang out as a parent, Serena explains why there's often resentment, why the child is seen as a burden rather than someone you ought to love. That is why often we get better relationships formed with the child, because you otherwise would not be able to access it in the first place. Let me respond to how they deal with this. Their response is, well, close bonds won't be formed because you have to spend time with like 8 parents. I want to say a few things here. The first is, the majority of this is preempted in our case, re-incentives, because parents or co-parents are probably cognizant of this fact, which is why they're likely to volunteer, which is why, because they volunteered, that suggests that they do care for these kids and will want to love them, meaning that the feeling that you are loved, even if it is by many people, is probably enough to form a reciprocal relationship with them. Think about adopted parents and foster kids. They are able to form those kinds of bonds, even if they have no predating genetic relationship, because they're able to spend lots of time with them where they feel loved and supported. But even where the case where it is mandatory, i.e. reciprocal, you probably have an incentive to love that child because you get what you're going to give, because the parent of the child that you are helping parent is going to be a person that's parenting your child in the future. But thirdly, though, note on weighing that this argument is a non-argument in the context where many parents will not be able to form these bonds in the first place. You need the flexible situation, otherwise you're not able to form bonds. So you can't take time off work, for example, because maternity leave is often inaccessible. So the comparative is, do you not have the child, in which case all of our third argument flows, or do you have the child and not spend any time with them, which is often actually what is happening at the moment. Before I go on to the rest of this theme, I'll take the point.
If times are so hard and it benefits everybody to be more friendly, then they would do it either way in the status quo as well. What you had to defend is parents having equal roles and a child perhaps viewing multiple people in the similar esteem as their biological parent.
I'm sorry, there's an obvious difference between having a family friend and having that family friend raise you like they were your own. That is the comparative in this debate, and that's what we have been defending. You'll have to engage with that in the op block like you love dumping. Let's look at the rest of the responses I want to point out here. The last thing I want to say is that often it's not so much the quality of time, but it's actually the quantity of time spent. Because not feeling like you have someone to love you all the time is actually critically damaging to many people. So maybe the hour you spend with your parent daily is the best hour of your life. That doesn't change the fact that you feel alone in the world, that no one cares for you. So at the conclusion of this theme, what we have demonstrated is that there are workplace incentives to not have many parents have kids, or at least keep them from having those children, due to all the pressures that Serena and Alex described, meaning that we get more of a relationship formed with the child because there is less of a pressure to raise that child on your own because you can rely on the broader community, which is a guarantee. Let's look at the second question then. First thing I want to deal with is this concept on views. So I do want to point out there is a tension because this characterization is where communities are divergent. Often values are actually linked to the area that you're living in. Rich people are going to tell their kids that's a shark eat shark world, or whatever the expression is, and that you ought to be selfish and work hard in a capitalistic economy. So that is extremely tense with their rebuttal, because if it is the case that you want to exclude your children from other values, then these communities will segregate anyway, and none of their benefits, none of their harms of kids being confused on what moral system to subscribe to does not make sense. But even if you do believe that kids are going to be confused, this is a really important response. Underline this. Kids will going to have their moral systems confused anyway when they're older, when they go off to college, when they go off to the workplace, when they meet different people. No, thank you. So we would much prefer that be earlier and formative, or at worst, it's a complete wash of what values you're exposed to. Then the critical difference in the two sides is twofold. The first is you have access to more parenting styles, so you have epistemic access to what benefits the child's development. USA asserts that's probably a bad thing. That's really interesting because it means that parents can actually adapt on our side. If one parenting style isn't working for your child, you have no comparison or no benchmark to other parenting styles. That's the nuance we gave you. But secondly, and this was not engaged with at all, so in your 12-minute block, try to deal with this. There is more accountability for poor parenting. It wasn't just about abusive parents. It was about parents who weren't doing the best things that they could for their kids. The norm now is that you give them up. So that rebuttal of assertion that you won't give them to other people doesn't really make sense, because that's where the debate lies. But you get more accountability for poor parenting because more people have a stake in the development of the child, because as I framed at the first, you have an emotional connection to that child now. That's why children's development is better in terms of the views espoused. Last thing I want to talk about is the effect on communities. We demonstrate why there's more of a tie within communities because everyone feels closer knit, because everyone has a similar project of raising their children. Look, for example, at Indigenous communities around the world where co-parenting is espoused, where there is emotional connection, and where that often leads to more close-knit communities. They say, segregation happens. But the problem here is that segregation probably happens anyway. In a very close-knit family where you're all rich and you're living in a very poor area, you have no interest in exposing them to different views. So what's more likely to happen is just one family imposing those symmetrical values on their side if their characterization is true, versus many families doing that. At least on our side, that family is able to be adaptive. That family is able to actually have the flexibility. My mom locked in. I love you, Mom. Okay, so at the conclusion of this speech, it should be very clear that you have more relationship with working parents, even if it is hard for them. Even if that wasn't true, a divergent set of views is better for accountability and better for better parenting styles. And at worst, we get closer knit communities and closer community ties. It is too late in Op 3rd to reply, even if you want to dump all new content. Very proud to propose.
Thank you, speaker, for that speech. With that, let's have the third speaker of the opposition whenever you're ready.
Thank you. And I would prefer audible POIs. Three things I want to talk about in this speech. First, on the parenting and development of the child. Second, on the integration of communities. Finally, is this policy morally justified? First, on the parenting and the development of the child. The first thing I want to do in this clash is to take out the arguments that are just non-unique. They tell you that if you don't have a meal or your parents are working, you don't get your basic necessities. And this deals with the two warrants in their first argument and in their third argument. And in terms of no food and no financials, I want to say if they get like community support and people are willing to give them meals and financial support, then we can get the same resources through taxes to fund welfare programs, to fund support for single mothers, to subsidize daycares, right? This was a framework we gave you at the beginning of Op 1. Presumably, if they get all this political capital and resources from the community and itself to provide individually, then we can also get it collectively in the forms of government programs to support these people to get welfare, etc. And it's to the point, like their proposition says, where parents spend 0 hours of time with them, then the parents wouldn't have children, right? Because on their side of the house, there's still legal guardians. If they can spend 0 hours with them, it's still not going to be a good thing for the child. So what their proposition ties to collapse on about love has no merit in this debate. Next thing I want to refute is the argument they try to forward in their second proposition about viewpoints being diverse. Look, the most basic forms of your worldview are usually done when you're before like 14 years old. We do agree you usually are indoctrinated in families, but the basic form of humanity, because you don't pop out of the womb and be like, oh, I'm suddenly rational, I can distinguish between conservatism and liberalism. Their world is this. A 5-year-old child is going to be exposed to all religious practices, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, and Hinduism. Then Team Canada believes that the child is going to choose rationally which ones align with their own views. No, even though they have a choice, whatever choice they're going to make before it happens, because it happens before their brain fully develops, is still going to be arbitrary, as all views are due to the environment around us. At best, their benefits on political and religious diversity are marginal, because Abby noted to you that you get diversity from authority figures like teachers. But I'm also going to prove to you in the second clash that when you get more integrations of broad communities in the adult, and so if you correctly believe that adults can make rational choices, this clash goes to us. But you seem to disagree.
So this debate, to be clear, isn't all about fiat. We explained 3 devastating reasons for first, why communities have incentives to take care of these children. You assert comparatively that you can get billions of dollars into a broken childcare system.
No, okay, here's the thing. So you feel that every person in the community is going to provide every meal to every underprivileged children and is going to spend all of their time taking care of them. Presumably, if people have the want to do that on their side house, we can fiat some resources going to child support systems, going to welfare systems, because this is another form of parenting. We just support individual family units and support going to those family units. This is a non-argument on their side house. What was the argumentation we gave you? Ashley told you from one that the diverse parenting styles are confusing. And what third proposition and second proposition failed to consider is that this wasn't about love. This wasn't about how much you love your child, because you're probably going to get people who love children on either side of the house. This was about the parenting styles. It was about whether you're more free in how your child gets exercise choices, or whether you're more like a tiger parent, right? And we don't think that either parenting style, there's a consensus of which one is right or which one is wrong. But what we do tell you is that when you have multiple of these parenting styles mixed into one, where there are many people acting as step parents, and one of them is acting as tiger parents, the other is giving you more freedom, and there are different clashes in moral values. That means as a child, in your crucial basic development, you are confused about whether to pick. You don't get your basic development because your authority figures are telling you conflicting views. And because we told you from one, the vast majority of parents do love, they do care about their children. The fact is, too many cooks in the kitchen means you get worse development of the child and worse parenting because they conflict. We got 0 direct response from side proposition. The second one we also told you was about time frame, that the ability to know your child, to know their quirks, and to know their needs comes from spending years day in and day out with your children. What they tell you on their side is just, oh, we get more love because there are more people loving you. But the fact is, if time is spread out over a larger amount of parents, then each of those individual co-parents don't have the ability to know you as you grew up. They don't spend day in and day out, know you, and thus they can't adapt their parenting style to the best way your children should perform, right? Because if you don't know your children's quirks, you don't know their needs, you get less parenting and less development on their side of the house. This was the most important part of this clash, because even if you believe you get more diversity of political and religious views, you always weigh this clash more. Why? Because this deals with the basic development of the child, how to be a normal functioning member of society, which is critical to their success later on in life, how to instill successful moral values in your children, because on their side house, there are conflicting moral values that the child doesn't know what to choose in. And so you always weigh this more, and we win this debate because we solely prove to you that you get better parenting. Second clash I want to talk about is integration and community. And it was sad to see a lack of response, because the only thing that third proposition told you is, oh, the benefits are symmetrical because communities are already homogeneous and they're already segregated. We told you that yes, communities are already homogeneous in wealth and racial lines right now. The problem is side proposition exacerbates that because use the warrant that proposition 1 gave you on how children feel an obligation to their community. This means that children are less likely to move out of the particular community because the social network is that small neighborhood, right? So granted that these communal parenting is happening in small neighborhoods and happening with these wealthy white neighborhoods and happening in these poor gentrified ones, that means you get less cross-pollinations of people across broad communities as a whole. Why did we tell you this is bad? First, you don't get economic development. And the reason for this was because if you live in a poor area and you're less likely to go out, move out and get a job in a richer area, then you further segregate these areas by trapping them into economic disparities, and meaning that you also don't get things such as remittances and economic development for the most poor areas of the cities. Second, we told you get less integration and less diversity of views. Remember the characterization that we've given you down the bench. Adults are the only ones who are able to make free choices. So in terms of religious and political views, you should always value the diversity you get as an adult. If we're able to prove to you that you have less cross-pollination, they're less likely to move out of your community in order to seek a job, that means you see more segregation on their side of the house, on racial lines, on ideological lines that mean you further cement social disparities and social viewpoints, which is crucial to this debate. You weigh this over the other arguments because even if we lose a previous clash, that they get more marginal benefits on the individual development of the child, recognize that the majority of the years of the life you spend in a rational way is as an adult. So we win this debate. The third thing I want to talk about is a principle. And this was the third argument that Abby gave you that got a lack of response. And Proposition 1 told you that this was going to be a social norm, that you're going to be expected to take care of the children. The problem is you undermine the autonomy of community members who perhaps don't want to be parents. And this principle is a way to debate, right? Because if a person doesn't want to be a parent and have many time obligations, then they shouldn't be pressured, they shouldn't be coerced to care for other children. And recognize, even if you buy their practical analysis, it is immoral to use adults in this way, to force them to become community members, to force them to access practical benefits, because you're essentially forcing them to work as a job. Recognize that the time obligations and the financial obligations they talk about to children harm your individual autonomy of your own life. So if people don't want to be a parent, side proposition is essentially forcing them to become a communal parent. This is something we're morally against and practically against. I'm very proud to be opposing.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech, and without further ado, let's have the reply speaker of the opposition.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? I think the biggest strategic note to make at the end of this debate is that we see a massive case shift at the top of Prop 3, where now you're suddenly loving children as your own. Let's look at what Prime Minister told us in the beginning, right? Note that in Prime Minister, the examples that they brought up were dinner with your new stepdad. It was sleeping over when your parents couldn't support you. It was knowing that when your parents weren't able to support you as a primary caregiver, you have other individuals to turn to, which wasn't their burden at the beginning of this debate, because this debate, when we read the motion, is about having multiple authority figures in your lives, but not adult figures just there to help you out when your primary one cannot help. Note that for all of their material to actualize, you're going to have spheres of influence that actively combat the one that you spend the most time with. And if the original characterization given was that you just don't spend that much time with them in the first place, then I'm unsure where all their benefits accrue. The only reason why we had to address this in op block, Randy, is because you gave an entirely new case with new characterization of what your side even defended. So I don't think that's really our fault. They realized they couldn't win this debate with dinners with your new stepmom when they just reverted to loving them as their own. Note that, Randy, your story happens in the status quo when people have natural incentives to help people who are struggling. So if individuals are truly struggling and it benefits the community to help each other out, I'd argue that happens on our side without communal parenting when you make it a social norm, not when just people have natural incentives to like see their suffering neighbor and like alleviate some of their pain by like taking care of their kid for a day. So given that, firstly, I want to talk about development. Let's engage with their first type of characterization. We already told you that with the case given by P1 and P2, the exposure from their dinner or their exposure from the time of the activities that they have characterized and described and relied on have asymmetrical benefits on our side of the house when you have access to exposure and broad societal knowledge through your teachers, through your classmates, when you go to school, when you go out of town, etc. We get no response to this. Secondly, they say that no, these other figures don't like actively push their ideas on you, right? They don't actively indoctrinate you in any sort of way. They act as a counteraction. Note that in order for them to have so much power to act as a counterbalance to whatever narrative that you actually are receiving, that means they inherently have to impose some sort of view on you to be strong enough to get you and the other parent to reconsider their parenting means. So I'd argue that they cannot cop out of this social implication. They cannot cop out of saying that the other parents won't actually indoctrinate you just by saying that, oh, they won't spend as much time. It just won't be that way. We really get no reason. But now let's engage with the new characterization we get in P3, which is about like diverse views and how people will love you as your own, etc. Firstly, on the idea of diverse views, the only response we hear from the diverse parenting perspective is that, oh, it's somewhat correlative to the areas you live in, to your socioeconomic status, etc. We agree that sure, sometimes there is correlation, but that correlation is far less correlative than any of the other things we tell you about, right? Sure, that people from poor communities can have more of a divergent view on parenting, whether or not they do value kindness, because I don't think that being poor or being in a bad position inherently pushes you to think a certain way about the world. Even if that were to be true, their incentives of homogeneity are far more likely to accrue when these people likely have the same political incentives, the same type of views of society as well, what they want to push for, etc. So I think on their side of the house, they're still quite homogenous. These individuals don't get whatever diverse views that they want to talk about that actually combats whatever tiger mom that they want to talk about if these views aren't that strong in the first place. But now lastly, on the idea of love, we already told you that it takes 10 years to love somebody. We think that it takes 10 years to truly get to know someone. If you're spending time with 4 different parents, it's highly unlikely that you're going to feel the same way. We think we get that on our side of the house with family, friends, etc. It's just not the same. But lastly, on the argument they never engage with, which is about poor communities and how people get more autonomy in the future. We brought this in the Op2 as well as the Op3. We told you that for these poor communities, these racialized communities, they feel forced to give back to their communities and stay where they are, which means far less cross-pollination when they don't feel willing to seek that higher employment opportunity or to go to college and seek a better job because they feel inherent obligations to their own community, which forces them to stay there, which means that on their side of the house, this problem is far exacerbated when people don't have an incentive to leave and feel as though it's their societal duty to stay here and take care of the kids. We think that's deeply immoral. We're proud to stand on that opposition.
Can everyone hear me? The first 2 arguments we got out of first opposition was one about the harms of diversity and one about the harms of homogeneity. This echoed down the bench when, after we repeatedly pushed them to reconcile this, the only response they could offer thus was, okay, actually, this isn't about diversity of racial backgrounds or religion or political beliefs. This is about diversity of parenting styles. This response was woefully inadequate and lost them the debate today. Thus, I want to talk to you about two things in my speech. First, how communal parenting changes children. Second, how communal parenting changes communities. But before that, I just want to highlight that third opposition cannot bring in a principled argument and try to make it a path to victory. All of this argumentation about how parents can't consent to communal parenting was not brought up by either prior speaker, and I don't think it's fair for them to introduce it so late in the debate. First, on how this changes children. What did we tell you on proposition? We said that the single parent-child relationship was strained for a variety of reasons, because sometimes parents have to work long hours or work night shifts and can't be there for their children. We told you there was a spectrum of strictness amongst parents. For example, if I have a friend that does drugs and my biological parents are strict, if I tried to talk to them to seek help for my friend, they might tell me that I'm not allowed to hang out with them anymore. Whereas what we get on our side when you have a diversity of parents is you have more flexible parents you can go to and talk about this issue. You have parents you can trust with different things. I think that for that reason, we won on this idea. But the only responses the opposition was able to level is that we're going to fund childcare instead and that we're going to confuse children. I think there was some level of deadlock under this issue, and we broke it in several ways. First, we pointed out over and over again that their case was hung on the characterization of homogeneity, and they never responded except for saying, well, this is about parenting styles, not cultural or racial or economic differences. But note that a lot of parenting styles are cultural. So if you bought their case, none of their argumentation about being pulled in different directions was likely to apply. Second, in their third, they literally conceded that we had marginal benefits in terms of diversity and then tried to co-opt them by saying, okay, well, teachers are going to do this too. Well, in that case, all of their harms about diversity were going to be symmetrical because teachers were going to be imposing these viewpoints on you too. So I don't see why any of their case was actually unique given the counter prop that they pushed to you. But finally, I want to talk about love and do some weighing here, because it's simple way to solve this is that if everyone loves children equally, then they want the best parenting style and they can discuss what works best for the kid. We brought this to you right from first. If the harms are symmetrical, then even if you have conflicting morals, you still have love. And on their side, there was no guarantee of this. There was no guarantee that your parent who was never home who never was there when you came home from school at the end of the day would be able to provide you with the love or the emotional support you needed. On our side, that was a guarantee, and that's so powerful that I think we can win this debate. Second, on communities, they said that you have an obligation to stay in communities if you're poor. One, I don't see why their counter prop was any different. Maybe 3.0 would have told us if he wasn't busy forwarding a new principle. But I think that if you presumably are going to have a community that provides you with immense amount of childcare and immense amount of social support, you probably would feel the same obligation on both sides. We told you this. But second, we pointed out that they never mechanized to you why this was going to be the dominant manifestation of the obligation that people felt from communal parenting. Because perhaps moving out and getting a higher paying job and donating money back to your community might have been a better way to actually fulfill this obligation. We just told you that the obligation exists, and they asserted this was how it was going to manifest. But finally, when they told you about homogeneity, they never explained the increase in marginal harm after we pushed them on saying homogeneity was worse on their side because you only had one parent. On our side, we had many. For that reason, I think on proposition, we won this debate. Thank you.
I'd like to thank everyone for that debate. It was a wonderful debate. Just give me 1 second. Let me look at the process for how we're gonna go about the deliberation. Okay. So everyone, please stay in the room. We'll be back with our decision in a little bit. Panelists, please let me stop the recording first.